England 1816. The season had arrived with its usual fanfare of glittering balls, strategic introductions, and matrimonial machinations that would determine the fates of countless young women across the realm. Yet in the drawing-room of Thornfield House in Mayfair, Miss Eleanor Hartley sat with a book of philosophical essays open in her lap, utterly indifferent to the parade of eligible gentlemen being catalogued by her mother in increasingly desperate tones. "The Marquis of Ashford has expressed interest in making your acquaintance," Lady Margaret Hartley announced, her voice carrying that particular blend of hope and exasperation that had become her constant companion where her middle daughter was concerned. "He is extremely wealthy, possesses 3 estates, and his lineage is impeccable. If you love stories of courage and passion, subscribe and never miss one." Eleanor looked up from her reading, her grey eyes reflecting the sharp intelligence that had both blessed and cursed her existence in polite society. At 26, she possessed a beauty that was more striking than conventional, strong features, an expressive mouth, and a bearing that suggested she would neither bend nor break under the weight of expectation. Her chestnut hair, caught up in a simple style that eschewed the elaborate arrangements favoured by fashion, framed a face that revealed every thought and feeling with disconcerting clarity. "And what manner of man is he, mother, beyond his property and pedigree?" Eleanor inquired, closing her book with deliberate care. "Does he read? Does he think? Does he possess any opinions on matters of consequence, or does he merely echo whatever his peers pronounce?" Lady Margaret's expression tightened with familiar frustration. Her middle child had always been different from her siblings. Her eldest son, Edmund, had married a suitable young woman of good family and now managed the Hartley estates with admirable competence, while her youngest, Charlotte, had recently become engaged to the Earl of Pembroke after a whirlwind courtship that lasted precisely 6 weeks. Only Eleanor remained stubbornly, bewilderingly unmarried, despite possessing both beauty and breeding sufficient to secure an excellent match. "Eleanor, I do not interview these gentlemen on their philosophical positions," her mother replied with barely contained irritation. "That would be most unseemly. What I know is that the Marquis is well regarded, well connected, and willing to overlook your... My unfortunate habit of possessing and expressing opinions," Eleanor supplied coolly. "How magnanimous of him. I shall be sure to demonstrate my profound gratitude by remaining silent in his presence, lest I frighten him with evidence of rational thought." Her mother rose from her chair with an agitated rustle of silk. "Your sarcasm does you no credit, my dear. You are 26 years old. Your opportunities are not infinite. If you continue to alienate every gentleman who shows the slightest interest, you will find yourself quite alone." "I would rather be alone with my integrity intact than partnered with a man who requires me to diminish myself for his comfort," Eleanor responded, her voice steady despite the emotion churning beneath the surface. "I have studied too much, read too widely, and thought too deeply to pretend ignorance now. If society cannot accommodate a woman who refuses to perform helplessness, then society's deficiency is not mine to remedy." The words hung in the air between them, a declaration that had been building for years. Eleanor had never been like other girls. Even as a child, she had asked questions that made her governesses uncomfortable, challenged assumptions that were meant to be accepted without examination. Her father, an indulgent man with progressive inclinations, had allowed her access to his extensive library and even permitted her to sit in on her brother's lessons with his tutors. The result was a woman whose education rivaled that of many gentlemen, whose command of languages, literature, philosophy, and political economy was both remarkable and, in the eyes of many, profoundly unmarriageable. Lady Margaret departed with a sigh that conveyed both defeat and disappointment, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts and her book. She returned her attention to the essay before her, a treatise on individual liberty that resonated deeply with her own convictions about personal autonomy and the right to self-determination. But her concentration proved elusive as her mother's words echoed in her mind. 26, opportunities not infinite, quite alone. The truth was that Eleanor was not indifferent to the prospect of marriage. She simply refused to settle for the kind of union she had witnessed too often in society, where wives became little more than decorative possessions, their thoughts dismissed, their aspirations confined to domestic trivialities. She wanted what seemed impossible, a partnership of equals, a meeting of minds and hearts, a man who would value her intelligence rather than merely tolerate it. Such men, if they existed at all, were extraordinarily rare in her experience. That evening, Eleanor accompanied her family to Lady Thornbury's ball, one of the season's most anticipated events. The ballroom blazed with the light of 1,000 candles reflected in crystal chandeliers, and the cream of society swirled across the polished floor in elaborate dances that followed patterns as rigid and prescribed as the social conventions that governed every aspect of their existence. Eleanor positioned herself near the windows, where a slight breeze offered relief from the oppressive heat generated by hundreds of bodies in close proximity. She watched the dancers with a mixture of detachment and anthropological curiosity, noting the careful choreography of glances and gestures, the strategic positioning of ambitious mothers and their marriageable daughters, the predatory assessment in the eyes of fortune hunters evaluating potential prey. "You observe rather than participate, Miss Hartley," a deep voice remarked beside her. "A choice or a circumstance?" Eleanor turned to find herself regarding a tall gentleman of perhaps 30 years, whose dark hair and piercing blue eyes suggested intelligence and a certain dangerous intensity. He was dressed impeccably in black evening clothes that emphasized his athletic build, and he carried himself with an authority that spoke of high rank and absolute confidence. Most striking, however, was the directness of his gaze. He looked at her as though he actually saw her, rather than merely cataloguing her appearance and prospects according to the usual mercenary calculations. "A choice, sir," she replied, meeting his gaze without the demure lowering of eyes that convention demanded. "I find observation more instructive than participation in rituals whose meaning has been lost beneath layers of empty form." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps or interest. Most young ladies would have responded with a simpering pleasantry, not a philosophical critique of social customs. "A bold assessment," he observed, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth, "and one that suggests you have given considerable thought to the nature and purpose of our social institutions." "I have given considerable thought to many things, sir," Eleanor responded. "It is both my blessing and my curse. Society prefers its women decorative and docile, not thoughtful and questioning. Then society demonstrates remarkably poor judgment," he replied with conviction that surprised her. "Decoration fades and docility becomes tedious. Intelligence and courage, however, only grow more valuable with time." Before Eleanor could formulate a response to this extraordinary statement, they were interrupted by the arrival of Lady Thornbury herself, flushed with the exertion of managing her elaborate entertainment. "Your Grace," their hostess exclaimed, her eyes widening with obvious delight at discovering this particular guest in conversation with the Hartley girl. "I was not certain you would attend this evening. You honor my humble gathering with your presence, Your Grace." The words penetrated Eleanor's consciousness with delayed impact. She had been conversing with a duke, and not just any duke, but judging from Lady Thornbury's reaction, one of considerable importance. "Lady Thornbury," the gentleman acknowledged with a slight bow. "You have outdone yourself as always. I was just becoming acquainted with Miss Hartley, whom I find quite refreshingly forthright in her observations." Their hostess's expression suggested she was uncertain whether this represented a compliment or a criticism. "Yes, well, Miss Hartley is known for her. That is to say, she possesses a rather unusual intelligence," the Duke supplied firmly. "A quality I have always found admirable, regardless of the sex of its possessor." Lady Thornbury's mouth opened and closed soundlessly before she managed to excuse herself to attend to other guests, leaving Eleanor alone once more with her mysterious conversational partner. If you love stories of courage and passion, subscribe and never miss one. "You have not introduced yourself properly, Your Grace," Eleanor observed, recovering her composure. "You allowed me to speak quite freely without revealing your rank." "Henry Blackwood, Duke of Ashbourne," he supplied with a slight smile. "And I did not reveal my rank because I was enjoying the novelty of being addressed as a man rather than as a title. You spoke to me with a candor that would have been impossible had you known my position from the outset. Eleanor studied him carefully, reassessing the exchange in light of this new information. The Duke of Ashbourne was legendary throughout society, fabulously wealthy, possessing one of the oldest titles in England, and notoriously particular about feminine company. He had rejected every matrimonial overture made in his direction for over a decade, earning a reputation for impossible standards and a temperament that alternated between glacial formality and cutting wit. He was, by all accounts, the most eligible and most unapproachable bachelor in the realm. "Then I shall continue to address you with candor, Your Grace," she replied evenly. "Since I have already compromised myself by speaking freely, there seems little point in adopting artifice now." His smile broadened into something genuinely warm. "An excellent philosophy. Tell me, Miss Hartley, would you consent to dance with me? I find myself curious to continue our conversation, and the waltz provides a socially acceptable framework for extended discourse." The request startled Eleanor more than she cared to admit. A Duke of Ashbourne's stature and consequence did not dance with women of her relatively modest position, at least not without significant motivation. Yet, there was nothing in his expression or manner that suggested anything beyond genuine interest in her company. "I would be honored, Your Grace," she replied, placing her gloved hand in his extended palm. As they took their positions on the floor, Eleanor became acutely aware of the attention focused upon them. Heads turned, conversations ceased mid-sentence, and fans began fluttering with increased velocity as society registered the extraordinary sight of the Duke of Ashbourne leading the peculiar Hartley girl into a waltz. "You have just made me the subject of intense speculation," Eleanor murmured, as they began to move through the prescribed patterns of the dance. "Good," Henry replied, his hand warm and steady at her waist. "Perhaps it will inspire others to reconsider their assumptions about what makes a woman worthy of attention. Or it will simply add to my reputation as an oddity," she countered, though she found herself smiling despite her words. "Tell me, Miss Hartley," he said as they swept across the floor with a grace that suggested considerable practice on his part, "what subjects have you been studying recently? Lady Thornbury mentioned you possess unusual intellectual pursuits." Most gentlemen, when they asked such questions, expected innocuous answers about poetry or perhaps music. Eleanor hesitated, debating whether to offer a safe response or to risk his disapproval with honesty. "I have been reading Locke's treatises on government and individual liberty," she admitted, watching his face carefully for signs of displeasure or mockery. "I find his arguments regarding natural rights and the social contract quite compelling, though I confess frustration that he, like so many philosophers, fails to extend his principles of individual autonomy to women." Rather than recoiling or changing the subject, as she expected, Henry's eyes lit with genuine interest. A cogent observation. The contradiction between Enlightenment principles of universal human rights and the simultaneous acceptance of women's subordination reveals a remarkable failure of logical consistency. Eleanor nearly stumbled in surprise, causing Henry to steady her with a gentle pressure at her waist. You have read Locke?" "I have indeed," he confirmed, "along with Rousseau, though I find his romanticization of the natural state ultimately unconvincing. I've also read Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Woman, which I suspect you would find quite aligned with your own thinking." The waltz continued, but Eleanor was barely aware of the movement, so focused was she on the conversation unfolding between them. Here was a man, a duke no less, who not only possessed the education to engage with serious philosophical texts, but who had apparently considered their implications for women's rights with genuine thoughtfulness. "I have read Wollstonecraft," she confirmed, her voice dropping to a near whisper despite the music surrounding them, "though I must confess, I keep my copy hidden in my chamber. My mother would be horrified to discover such radical material in her daughter's possession." "Radical," Henry repeated with a slight smile, a word used to dismiss ideas that challenge comfortable assumptions. "I have never understood why the notion that women possess reason and deserve education should be considered radical rather than self-evident." "Because admitting it would require restructuring the entire social order," Eleanor replied, warming to a subject that had occupied her thoughts for years. "If women are acknowledged as rational beings deserving of autonomy, then the whole edifice of male authority, legal, social, economic, becomes far more difficult to justify. Precisely, he agreed, guiding her through a turn with practiced ease. Which is why those who benefit from the current arrangement resist so strenuously any questioning of its foundations. The waltz concluded too quickly for Eleanor's liking. As Henry escorted her back to the periphery of the ballroom, she found herself reluctant to relinquish his company and return to her usual position as observer and outsider. "Thank you for the dance, Your Grace," she said formally, executing a proper curtsy despite her internal turmoil. "The pleasure was entirely mine, Miss Hartley," he replied, bowing over her hand. Then, lowering his voice so that only she could hear, he added, "I wonder if you might permit me to call upon you tomorrow afternoon. I find our conversation far too interesting to conclude so abruptly." Eleanor's heart accelerated in a most undignified manner. "I would be pleased to receive you, Your Grace." His smile, warm and genuine, transformed his typically austere features. "Excellent. Until tomorrow, then." As he departed, Eleanor became aware of the numerous eyes fixed upon her with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. She had just been singled out by the Duke of Ashbourne in the most public manner possible, and society would demand answers she did not yet possess herself. Her mother materialized at her elbow within moments, practically vibrating with suppressed excitement. "Eleanor, the Duke of Ashbourne, he danced with you and now he intends to call tomorrow? My dear, this is extraordinary. Do you understand what this means?" "It means I had an interesting conversation with an educated gentleman," Eleanor replied, attempting to maintain her composure despite the nervous energy coursing through her veins. Nothing more should be presumed from a single dance and a social call. "A single dance from the Duke of Ashbourne is worth a dozen courtships from lesser men," her mother insisted, her eyes gleaming with renewed matrimonial hope. "He has rejected every eligible young lady in London for the past 10 years. If he is showing interest in you, there must be something significant behind it." Eleanor chose not to respond, unwilling to feed her mother's speculation or acknowledge the dangerous hope unfurling in her own chest. She had long ago resigned herself to spinsterhood rather than compromise her principles. The possibility that she might have encountered a man who valued her mind as well as her person seemed too improbable to credit. Yet Henry Blackwood had conversed with her as an intellectual equal, had engaged with her ideas rather than dismissing them, had suggested further acquaintance rather than retreating in discomfort from her frankness. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of whispered conversations and speculative glances. Eleanor endured a parade of acquaintances, suddenly eager to renew her friendship, transparent in their desire to extract information about her connection to the Duke. She responded to their inquiries with polite vagueness, protecting both her privacy and the fragile possibility that had emerged from an unexpected conversation. That night, alone in her chamber, Eleanor sat at her writing desk and attempted to record her thoughts in the journal she had maintained since girlhood. But the words would not come with their usual clarity. Instead, she found herself replaying every moment of her encounter with Henry Blackwood, the intelligence in his eyes, the respect in his manner, the extraordinary content of their conversation. He had spoken to her as an equal, had validated her thoughts rather than condemning them as unfeminine, had suggested that her intelligence was valuable rather than problematic. The possibility terrified her more than she cared to admit. She had built her identity around intellectual independence and refusal to compromise. What if Henry Blackwood was exactly the kind of man she had convinced herself did not exist? What if he offered the partnership of equals she had yearned for but never expected to find? The risk of disappointment loomed large, yet the potential reward made the risk seem almost bearable. The following afternoon arrived with agonizing slowness. Eleanor changed her dress 3 times before settling on a simple but elegant day gown in deep blue that brought out the grey of her eyes. She arranged her hair with more care than usual, then immediately felt foolish for such obvious vanity. This was a social call, she reminded herself sternly. Nothing more should be presumed. When the Duke of Ashbourne was announced precisely at 3 o'clock, Eleanor found her carefully cultivated composure deserting her entirely. He entered the drawing room with that combination of authority and grace that seemed innate to his character, carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Miss Hartley," he greeted her, bowing over her hand. "Thank you for receiving me." "Your Grace," she replied, gesturing toward the settee. "Please be seated. My mother will join us momentarily." "Actually," Henry said, his expression turning slightly rueful, "I took the liberty of requesting a private audience with your father first. He has granted permission for us to speak alone, provided the door remains open and a servant stationed nearby. I hope this arrangement does not offend your sensibilities." Eleanor felt her eyebrows rise in surprise. Such an arrangement suggested serious intent rather than casual acquaintance. "It does not offend me, though I confess curiosity about what you could possibly wish to discuss that requires such unusual accommodation." Henry's smile carried a hint of mischief. "I find that the presence of chaperones tends to constrain conversation to trivial pleasantries. Given the nature of our discourse last evening, I thought you might appreciate the opportunity for more substantive exchange." He extended the parcel toward her. "I brought you something. I hope you will accept it as a token of intellectual kinship rather than as any inappropriate overture." Eleanor unwrapped the package carefully, her breath catching when she discovered a beautiful leather-bound volume within. The title, stamped in gold, read, "A Vindication of the Rights of Woman," by Mary Wollstonecraft. "Your Grace," she breathed, running her fingers over the fine binding. This must have cost—" "It is the second edition," he confirmed, "with Wollstonecraft's additional preface. I thought you might appreciate having a copy you need not hide in your chamber. A woman should not have to conceal reading material that advocates for her own humanity and dignity." The gesture moved Eleanor more deeply than she could articulate. Here was a man who not only understood her intellectual hunger, but actively encouraged it, who saw her reading of controversial texts not as something shameful, but as evidence of courage and independent thought. "Thank you," she managed, her voice unsteady with emotion. "This is perhaps the most thoughtful gift I have ever received." Henry settled into his chair, his posture relaxed despite the formal setting. "I have been thinking about our conversation last evening. You mentioned frustration with philosophers who advocate for individual liberty while excluding women from their considerations. I wonder if you have encountered similar contradictions in other areas of contemporary thought," and so began a conversation that lasted well over the socially acceptable duration for a morning call. They discussed political philosophy, literature, the moral implications of Britain's colonial endeavors, and the economic theories of Adam Smith. Eleanor found herself arguing points with passionate intensity, challenging Henry's positions when she disagreed, building upon his ideas when they aligned with her own thinking, and he, far from being offended by her intellectual assertiveness, seemed to relish the exchange, pushing back against her arguments with respect rather than condescension. "I disagree with Burke's conception of society as an organic entity bound by tradition and obligation," Henry asked at one point, leaning forward with evident interest. "I disagree with using tradition and obligation as justifications for perpetuating unjust hierarchies," Eleanor clarified. "Burke's conservatism serves those who benefit from existing arrangements while demanding that those who suffer under them accept their subordination as natural and inevitable. It is a philosophy that privileges stability over justice, continuity over progress. If you love stories of courage and passion, subscribe and never miss one." "And yet," Henry countered, "surely there is value in institutions that have evolved over centuries, in customs that bind communities together, in traditions that provide meaning and continuity across generations." "There is value in those things when they serve human flourishing," Eleanor agreed. "But when tradition becomes an excuse for cruelty, when custom demands the submission of half the population to the other half, when institutions perpetuate injustice simply because this is how it has always been done, then tradition becomes tyranny dressed in respectable garments." The passion in her voice surprised even herself. She half expected Henry to recoil from such vehemence, to retreat behind the formal politeness that men typically employed when women became too intense, too opinionated, too themselves. Instead, his eyes shone with what appeared to be admiration. "You argue with remarkable clarity and conviction," he observed. "I find myself reconsidering positions I thought settled." It is a rare experience and one I value highly." Their conversation was interrupted by the return of Lady Margaret, who had apparently decided that propriety demanded her presence regardless of Sir Thomas's permission for private discourse. She entered with a servant bearing tea and cakes, her expression hovering between hope and anxiety as she assessed the scene before her. "Your Grace," she greeted Henry warmly, "I trust my daughter has been an adequate hostess?" "More than adequate," Henry assured her, rising to bow respectfully. "Miss Hartley possesses both wit and wisdom in abundance. I have found our conversation most illuminating." Lady Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly at this characterization, clearly uncertain whether wit and wisdom represented compliments or criticisms when applied to a marriageable young lady. "How kind of you to say so. Eleanor has always been intellectually inclined." The slight pause before intellectually inclined suggested volumes about Lady Margaret's ambivalence regarding her daughter's scholarly pursuits. Henry appeared to note this as well, for his expression cooled slightly. "Then, Sir Thomas and Lady Margaret should take considerable pride in having raised a daughter whose mind is as cultivated as her manners," he said with deliberate emphasis. "Too many parents neglect the education of their daughters, producing women who can neither think critically nor converse meaningfully on matters of substance. You have done your daughter a great service by encouraging her intellectual development." The subtle rebuke in his words was unmistakable. Lady Margaret had not encouraged Eleanor's intellectual development. She had merely failed to prevent it, largely because Sir Thomas had been more indulgent than convention typically permitted. But Henry's reframing of the situation as praiseworthy rather than regrettable left Lady Margaret with little choice but to accept the compliment with flustered grace. After an additional quarter-hour of polite conversation, Henry took his leave, but not before securing permission to call again the following afternoon and to escort Eleanor to an exhibition of scientific instruments at the Royal Society the following week. When he departed, Lady Margaret turned to her daughter with an expression of mingled excitement and confusion. "Eleanor, I confess I do not entirely understand what is happening, but the Duke of Ashbourne is clearly courting you. His attentions, the gifts, the request for private conversation with your father, these are not the actions of a man engaged in casual acquaintance." "He values intelligent conversation, Mother," Eleanor replied, though her heart raced with the implications of Henry's continued attention. "I suspect he finds me a novelty, a woman willing to engage with ideas rather than merely simper and flatter." "Novelty," her mother repeated skeptically. "Men do not court novelties, my dear. They marry them, and I think the Duke is very seriously considering marriage." The words sent a thrill of hope and terror through Eleanor in equal measure. Marriage to Henry Blackwood would mean so much: security, status, the resources to pursue her intellectual interests without constraint. But more than that, it would mean partnership with a man who seemed to genuinely value the very qualities that made her unmarriageable in the eyes of most gentlemen. It would mean not having to choose between love and authenticity, between companionship and integrity. Yet doubt plagued her. Was Henry truly as exceptional as he seemed, or was this merely an elaborate performance that would dissolve once he secured her affection? Would he continue to value her opinions after marriage, or would he expect her to transform into a conventional duchess, silent and ornamental? The questions tormented her through the evening and into the sleepless night that followed. The Duke's calls became a daily occurrence over the following weeks. Sometimes they conversed in the Hartley drawing-room, under Lady Margaret's increasingly perfunctory supervision. Other times, he escorted Eleanor to museums, galleries, and lectures, always with proper chaperonage, but with enough privacy to continue their ongoing intellectual discourse. Society watched this unlikely courtship with fascination and no small amount of malice. The gossip mills churned with speculation about what the Duke of Ashbourne could possibly see in the bookish Hartley girl. Some suggested it was merely eccentricity on his part, a duke's prerogative to indulge unusual whims. Others whispered more darkly about hidden motives and eventual disappointment. Lady Beatrice Thornbury, whose own daughter had been among the many young ladies rejected by the Duke, proved particularly venomous in her commentary. "One must wonder what arts that girl has employed to capture Ashbourne's attention," she remarked loudly at a musicale, clearly intending her words to reach Eleanor's ears. She lacks beauty, lacks grace, and lacks the feminine delicacy that one expects in a duchess. Perhaps the Duke simply appreciates her willingness to argue with him. Some men do enjoy women who forget their place. If you love stories of courage and passion, subscribe and never miss one. Eleanor overheard the comment and felt the familiar sting of social cruelty. But before she could formulate a response, Henry materialized at her side with an expression of cold fury. "Lady Thornbury," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent room. "I could not help but overhear your observations regarding Miss Hartley. Allow me to correct several misapprehensions you appear to harbor. Miss Hartley possesses beauty of both person and character, qualities that become more apparent with genuine acquaintance. She demonstrates grace of mind and spirit that far exceeds mere physical elegance. And as for feminine delicacy, if by that you mean intellectual vapidity and moral cowardice, then I am profoundly grateful she lacks it." He turned to address the assembled company at large, his authority as a duke lending weight to every word. "Miss Hartley represents precisely the kind of woman England should celebrate. Intelligent, courageous, principled, and unwilling to diminish herself for the comfort of those threatened by feminine capability. Any man fortunate enough to secure her regard would be blessed beyond measure. I count myself extraordinarily fortunate to be numbered among her acquaintance." The silence that followed was absolute. Lady Thornbury's face had gone scarlet with mortification, while other ladies looked variously shocked, envious, or thoughtful. Henry offered his arm to Eleanor with perfect composure. "Shall we take some air, Miss Hartley? I find the atmosphere has become rather stifling." Outside on the terrace, with the sounds of the musicale muted behind them, Eleanor finally found her voice. "You should not have done that. You have made yourself the subject of gossip and speculation." "I care nothing for gossip," Henry replied firmly. "What I will not tolerate is watching someone I—" He paused, seeming to reconsider his words. "Someone I hold in high regard being subjected to petty cruelty without defense. Lady Thornbury and her ilk represent everything that is wrong with our social arrangements. The privileging of conformity over character, appearances over substance." "Nevertheless," Eleanor said softly, studying his profile in the lamplight, "your defense of me will fuel speculation about your intentions. People will assume—" "People will assume correctly," he interrupted, turning to face her directly. "Eleanor, Miss Hartley, surely you must realize that my attentions have been anything but casual. I have called upon you daily for nearly a month. I have introduced you to my closest friends. I have defended your character in the most public manner possible. What do you imagine my intentions to be?" Her heart hammered against her ribs with such force she felt certain he must hear it. "I hardly dare imagine, Your Grace. The gulf between our positions, the unconventionality of the match. There are so many reasons why this should not—" "Name one reason that matters," he challenged. "Not what society thinks, not what convention demands, but one genuine reason why you and I should not pursue what is developing between us." "Because I am terrified," she admitted in a whisper. "Because I have built my life around the certainty of remaining unmarried rather than compromising who I am. Because the possibility that you might truly accept me as I am seems too improbable to believe. Because if I allow myself to hope and then discover that hope misplaced, I am not certain I could recover from the disappointment." Henry's expression softened with understanding. He reached for her hand, holding it gently between both of his own. "I cannot promise that I will be a perfect husband, Eleanor. I have my faults. I can be stubborn, demanding, sometimes too quick to anger when I perceive injustice, but I can promise you this. I will never ask you to diminish yourself for my comfort. I will never demand your silence on matters where you have opinions worth expressing. I will never treat your intelligence as a liability rather than an asset." He paused, his blue eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I did not come to London this season seeking a wife. I had resigned myself to remaining unmarried rather than settling for a conventional match that would bore me to distraction within a fortnight. And then I encountered a woman reading philosophy by the windows at a ball, looking at the assembled company with intelligent eyes that saw through all our pretensions and performances. A woman who spoke to me with honest directness rather than calculated flattery. A woman who argued with me, challenged me, made me reconsider positions I thought settled. "Henry," she breathed, the use of his given name slipping out before she could recall it. "I have fallen in love with you, Eleanor," he continued, his voice rough with emotion, "not despite your intelligence and courage, but because of them. Not in spite of your refusal to conform, but because that refusal reflects an integrity I have encountered in precious few people of either sex. You are extraordinary, and I would be honored, truly honored, if you would consent to become my wife." Tears spilled down Eleanor's cheeks before she could stop them. Every fear, every doubt, every year of loneliness and resignation crystallized in this moment of impossible possibility. Here was the man she had convinced herself did not exist, offering the partnership she had never dared hope for, valuing precisely those qualities that made her unmarriageable to every other gentleman in England. "I love you too," she whispered, the admission both terrifying and liberating. "I think I have loved you since that first conversation, when you spoke to me as an equal rather than as a curiosity or a problem to be managed. But Henry, you must understand what you are choosing. I will not transform into a conventional duchess. I will continue to read controversial texts, to hold opinions on political matters, to speak my mind even when silence would be more comfortable. I cannot promise to be anything other than exactly who I am." "And I am choosing exactly who you are," he assured her fervently. "I don't want a conventional duchess. I want a partner who will challenge my thinking, who will fight beside me for the causes we believe in, who will make our home a place of intellectual vitality rather than stultifying propriety. I want you, Eleanor Hartley, with all your brilliance and courage and refusal, to be anything less than fully yourself." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her gloved knuckles. "Will you marry me?" The question hung between them, weighted with all the implications and possibilities it carried. Eleanor looked into his eyes and saw nothing but sincerity, admiration, and love. Genuine love for the woman she actually was, not some diminished version she might pretend to be. "Yes," she breathed, her voice trembling with emotion and joy. "Yes, Henry, I will marry you." His smile was radiant, transforming his usually serious features into something warm and open. He pulled her gently into his arms, mindful of propriety but unable to resist holding her close for a moment. Eleanor rested her forehead against his chest, feeling his heart beat steadily beneath the fine fabric of his coat, grounding herself in the reality of this extraordinary moment. "I should speak to your father formally," Henry murmured against her hair, "though I confess I am reluctant to release you even for the time that will require." Eleanor laughed softly, a sound of pure happiness that surprised even herself. "My father will be relieved, I think. He has worried about my prospects for years. My mother will likely faint from shock and delight in equal measure." "And your siblings?" Henry asked, drawing back slightly to look at her face. "Edmund will approve, I believe. He has always understood me better than most. And Charlotte will be thrilled to have something more exciting to discuss than wedding flowers and trousseau selections." They returned to the musicale separately to avoid adding further fuel to the gossip. But the glow on Eleanor's face and the possessive way Henry watched her throughout the remainder of the evening left little doubt in anyone's mind that something significant had transpired between them. The following morning, Henry arrived at the Hartley residence at an unfashionably early hour to formally request Eleanor's hand in marriage. Sir Thomas, who had observed the developing courtship with a mixture of hope and trepidation, received the Duke in his study with ceremonial gravity. "Your Grace," Sir Thomas began, settling into his chair with the air of a man preparing for a difficult conversation, "I must be frank with you. My daughter is not. That is, she possesses qualities that many would consider unsuitable in a duchess. She is opinionated, argumentative at times, and shows little inclination toward the traditional feminine accomplishments. She would rather debate political philosophy than plan dinner parties, and she has absolutely no talent for pretending agreement when she fundamentally disagrees. Are you certain this is the wife you want?" Henry's expression grew stern. "Sir Thomas, with respect, I am not seeking your permission to marry some idealized version of your daughter that exists only in society's imagination. I am asking to marry Eleanor Hartley, exactly as she is, with all the intelligence, courage, and principled conviction that make her extraordinary. Those qualities you describe as unsuitable are precisely why I love her. I would no more wish to change them than I would wish her to stop breathing." Sir Thomas studied the Duke carefully, searching his face for any hint of doubt or second thoughts. Finding none, his expression softened into something approaching relief. "Then you have my enthusiastic consent, Your Grace. I had resigned myself to the likelihood that Eleanor would remain unmarried, not because she lacks worth, but because so few men possess the wisdom to recognize it. I am grateful that she has found one who does." Fiorsudi, when Eleanor was summoned to her father's study and informed of Henry's formal proposal and her father's acceptance, Lady Margaret burst into tears of joy, embraced her daughter with unprecedented enthusiasm, and immediately began planning what would undoubtedly be one of the season's most talked-about weddings. The announcement of the engagement sent shockwaves through London society. The Duke of Ashbourne, who had rejected every eligible beauty presented to him for over a decade, was to marry Miss Eleanor Hartley, a woman of modest fortune, unconventional interests, and 26 years. The gossip was relentless and often cruel, with many suggesting that the Duke had taken leave of his senses or that Miss Hartley had somehow entrapped him through cunning manipulation. But Henry faced the criticism with the same unwavering conviction he had shown in defending Eleanor at the musicale. When Lord Pemberton, emboldened by brandy at their club, suggested that the Duke might reconsider such an unusual match, Henry's response was swift and definitive. "Lord Pemberton," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room, "I am marrying the most intelligent, courageous, and principled woman I have ever encountered. She possesses more genuine worth in one of her thoughtful observations than most women of our acquaintance possess in their entire beings. If you or anyone else finds this match unusual, that says far more about the poverty of your judgment than it does about my choice of bride." The weeks leading up to the wedding were a whirlwind of activity, though not always of the sort Lady Margaret had envisioned. While Eleanor dutifully participated in the necessary preparations, selecting fabric for her trousseau, approving menu selections for the wedding breakfast, sitting for endless fittings with the modiste, she also spent considerable time with Henry, planning the kind of life they would build together. They walked in the park discussing which of Henry's estates would become their primary residence and how they might modernize its management. They visited his townhouse in London, where Eleanor was delighted to discover a library that rivaled her father's in scope and exceeded it in rarity of volumes. They attended lectures and exhibitions together, continuing the intellectual partnership that had first drawn them to one another. "I have been thinking," Henry said one afternoon as they strolled through Kew Gardens, ostensibly examining the botanical specimens, but primarily enjoying each other's company, "about establishing a school on one of my estates. Not a typical finishing school for young ladies learning to paint watercolors and play the pianoforte, but a proper academy that would offer girls the same rigorous education available to boys." Eleanor stopped walking, turning to face him with an expression of wonder. "Do you mean it? Truly?" "Completely," he confirmed. "We have the resources and I believe the moral obligation to use them for meaningful reform. You spoke once about how your education was the result of your father's indulgence and your own determination. Most girls lack those advantages. We could change that, at least in our corner of England." Tears of joy and gratitude filled Eleanor's eyes. "Henry, do you realize what you are offering? Not just to those future students, but to me. You are giving me the opportunity to put my principles into practice, to effect real change rather than merely theorizing about it." "We will effect that change together," he corrected gently. "This is our partnership, Eleanor. Your ideas, your values, your vision for a more just society, these are now mine to support and champion. That is what it means to be partners in truth, rather than merely in name." As their wedding day approached, Eleanor found herself alternating between excitement and anxiety. The excitement was straightforward. She was marrying a man she loved deeply, who valued her completely, who offered her a life of purpose and partnership. But the anxiety stemmed from the knowledge that their marriage would be conducted under intense public scrutiny, that every aspect of her behavior as the Duchess of Ashbourne would be examined and judged. Charlotte, now married herself to the Earl of Pembroke, and glowing with newlywed happiness, visited her sister the evening before the wedding, They sat together in Eleanor's chamber, surrounded by trunks of clothing and personal belongings being prepared for transport to Ashbourne House. "Are you frightened?" Charlotte asked, watching her sister with concerned affection. "Not of marriage," Eleanor replied honestly. "Not of Henry, but of everything else. The expectations, the scrutiny, the certainty that I will make mistakes and provide society with endless material for criticism." Charlotte took her sister's hand, squeezing it reassuringly. "Ellie, you have spent your entire life defying expectations and surviving criticism. You have remained true to yourself despite every pressure to conform. Why should marriage change that?" "Because now my choices reflect not only on myself, but on Henry," Eleanor explained. "I would not have him regret his decision to marry me because I proved too unconventional, too controversial, too much myself to fit the role of Duchess." "Then you misunderstand the man you are marrying," Charlotte said firmly. "The Duke did not choose you despite your unconventionality. He chose you because of it. He loves exactly who you are. Do not dishonor that love by trying to transform yourself into someone else." The wisdom in her younger sister's words struck Eleanor forcefully. She had spent so many years defending her right to be herself that she had not fully absorbed the miraculous reality that Henry needed no such defense. He knew her completely and loved her unreservedly. Her task now was not to change, but to trust in his love, in their partnership, in the strength of the foundation they had built together. The wedding took place on a brilliant June morning at St. George's Church in Hanover Square, with all of fashionable London in attendance. Eleanor walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her gown of ivory silk and Brussels lace, a masterpiece of restrained elegance that complemented rather than overwhelmed her natural beauty. But it was not the gown that drew gasps from the assembled guests. It was the expression on her face, a combination of joy, love, and unwavering confidence that transformed her from merely attractive to genuinely radiant. Henry waited at the altar, resplendent in his formal attire, his eyes fixed on his approaching bride with an intensity that left no doubt about his feelings. When Eleanor reached his side and placed her hand in his, the rightness of the moment settled over them both like a benediction. The ceremony itself was traditional, the vows ancient and solemn. But when Henry spoke his promises to love, honor, and cherish, Eleanor heard beneath the formal words his personal pledge to value, respect, and partner with her in all things. And when she repeated her own vows, she infused them with her commitment to stand beside him as an equal, to challenge and support him in equal measure, to build with him a marriage that honored both duty and love. The wedding breakfast at Ashbourne House was a lavish affair, attended by the cream of society, and characterized by the excellent food, flowing champagne, and undercurrent of gossip that accompanied all significant social events. But for Eleanor and Henry, the celebration was secondary to the profound reality of their union. They moved through the festivities hand in hand, presenting a united front that spoke eloquently of partnership and mutual devotion. When Lady Thornbury approached to offer her congratulations, her expression suggested she was swallowing something particularly bitter. Eleanor responded with gracious dignity that gave no hint of their previous encounters. "Thank you, Lady Thornbury. I appreciate your kind wishes." "You have made quite a remarkable match, Your Grace," Lady Thornbury replied, the title still sounding strange on Eleanor's ears. "I confess I never anticipated such an outcome." "Neither did I," Eleanor admitted with complete honesty. "But life has a way of surprising us, does it not? Sometimes the matches that seem most unlikely prove to be the most enduring." Henry materialized at her side, his hand coming to rest at the small of her back in a gesture of support and possession that was not lost on their observer. "Indeed, I consider myself extraordinarily fortunate to have recognized quality when I encountered it, rather than being distracted by superficial attractions that fade with time." The subtle dig at Lady Thornbury's beautiful but vapid daughter was unmistakable. The older woman's smile tightened fractionally before she excused herself to speak with other guests, leaving Eleanor and Henry alone for a moment amidst the crowd. "You are wicked," Eleanor murmured, though her eyes danced with amusement. "I am protective," Henry corrected, That woman has been unkind to you. I will not forget or easily forgive such treatment." As the afternoon wore into evening and the wedding breakfast concluded, Henry and Eleanor finally departed for Ashbourne Park, where they would spend the first weeks of their marriage away from the scrutiny and demands of London society. The journey took several hours, providing them with their first extended period of privacy as husband and wife. Eleanor sat beside Henry in his luxurious travelling carriage, her hand clasped in his, watching the countryside roll past the windows as twilight descended. The enormity of what had transpired that day, the irrevocable commitment they had made to one another, settled over her with a weight that was both daunting and deeply satisfying. "Regrets?" Henry asked softly, reading her contemplative expression with the accuracy that already characterized his understanding of her moods. "None whatsoever," she replied immediately. "Though I confess to some nervousness about the future. Being a duchess is rather different from being a gentleman's daughter." "You will be brilliant," he assured her with conviction. "You have intelligence, compassion, and courage in abundance. The role of duchess is whatever we make it. There is no requirement that you conform to anyone's preconceived notions of what a duchess should be." "Society may disagree with that assessment," Eleanor observed wryly. "Society," Henry replied with magnificent disdain, "has demonstrated consistently poor judgment. We will live according to our own values and principles, and if that makes us unconventional, so be it. I did not marry you to have a conventional duchess. I married you to have an extraordinary partner." They arrived at Ashbourne Park as full darkness descended, the ancient manor house illuminated by hundreds of welcoming candles. The servants lined up to greet their new mistress with a formality that both honored tradition and acknowledged the significance of the occasion. Eleanor moved along the line, greeting each servant with genuine warmth and making an effort to remember names and positions, not out of duty but from authentic interest in the people who would comprise her new household. The housekeeper, Mrs. Reynolds, a dignified woman of middle years, showed particular warmth in her welcome. "We are delighted to have you at Ashbourne Park, Your Grace. The house has needed a mistress for many years. His Grace has been bachelor too long." "Thank you, Mrs. Reynolds," Eleanor replied sincerely. "I hope you will be patient with me as I learn my new duties. I confess the management of an estate of this size is rather beyond my previous experience." "We will help you in every way we can, Your Grace," the housekeeper assured her. "And may I say, if I may be so bold, that His Grace seems happier than I have ever seen him. That bodes well for all of us. If you love stories of courage and passion, subscribe and never miss one." After the formal greetings concluded, Henry escorted Eleanor to the private apartments that would now be hers, a suite of rooms beautifully appointed and connected by a shared sitting room to Henry's own chambers. A fire blazed welcomingly in the hearth, and her belongings had already been unpacked and arranged by efficient servants. "I will leave you to rest and refresh yourself," Henry said, though his reluctance to leave her was evident. "We will dine privately tonight. I thought you might prefer that to a formal meal after such a long and emotional day." "That sounds perfect," Eleanor agreed gratefully. The prospect of a quiet meal with just Henry, free from the performance required by public settings, appealed enormously. When he departed to his own chambers, Eleanor allowed her maid to help her out of her wedding gown and into a comfortable evening dress. She then dismissed the girl, wanting a few moments of solitude to process the extraordinary transformation her life had undergone in a single day. She moved to the windows, looking out over the darkened parkland that stretched as far as she could see. This was her home now, these lands, these people, this life. She was the Duchess of Ashbourne, a position of privilege and responsibility that would have seemed impossible just months ago. More than that, she was Henry's wife, his partner, his chosen companion for life. A soft knock at the connecting door interrupted her reverie. "Come in," she called, turning to find Henry entering the sitting room, now changed into more casual evening attire. "I thought we might dine here rather than in the formal dining room," he suggested, "more intimate and conducive to conversation." They settled at a small table positioned near the fireplace, where servants had laid out a simple but elegant meal. As they ate, conversation flowed with the same ease that had characterized all their time together. They discussed plans for the estate, ideas for the school they hoped to establish, books they wanted to read together. The talk was comfortable, unhurried, interspersed with comfortable silences that felt natural rather than awkward. When the meal concluded and the servants cleared away the dishes, leaving them alone with a decanter of wine and the flickering firelight, Henry reached across the small space between them to take Eleanor's hand. "I want you to know," he said seriously, "that I have no expectations for tonight beyond your comfort. We have the rest of our lives together. There is no urgency, no requirement that anything happen according to anyone's schedule but our own." Eleanor felt a surge of love for this man who considered her feelings, even in moments governed by such strong conventions. "Henry, I appreciate your consideration more than I can express. But I am not frightened, at least no more than any bride on her wedding night. I love you, I trust you, and I want to begin our married life in truth, not merely in name." His eyes darkened with desire and tenderness in equal measure. He stood, drawing her to her feet and into his arms with gentle insistence. "Then let me show you," he murmured against her hair, "exactly how deeply I love you, how thoroughly I cherish you, how completely you have captured my heart." Their wedding night unfolded with a tenderness and passion that exceeded Eleanor's limited imaginings. Henry was patient, attentive, ensuring her comfort and pleasure with the same consideration he showed in all their interactions. And Eleanor, emboldened by love and trust, met him as an equal even in this most intimate of exchanges, discovering depths of physical connection that complemented the intellectual and emotional bonds they had already forged. Afterwards, lying in Henry's arms in his bed, now their bed, Eleanor felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. This was where she belonged, not despite who she was, but because of it. She had found not just a husband, but a true partner, someone who valued her completely and loved her unreservedly. "What are you thinking?" Henry asked softly, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "That I am happier than I ever imagined possible," she replied honestly. "That you have given me not just love but freedom, the freedom to be fully myself without apology or diminishment. It is an extraordinary gift." "You have given me the same," he murmured. "Before I met you, I was resigned to a life of duty without joy, obligation without passion. You showed me that it was possible to have both, that I did not have to choose between honoring my responsibilities and following my heart." The weeks that followed their wedding were among the happiest of Eleanor's life. They settled into a rhythm at Ashbourne Park that balanced Henry's responsibilities as landlord and nobleman with their shared interests and pursuits. Mornings were typically spent apart, Henry managing estate business while Eleanor familiarized herself with household management and began planning the school they hoped to establish. Afternoons they spent together, riding across the estate, walking through the gardens, or simply reading companionably in the library. Evenings were reserved for conversation, music. Eleanor played pianoforte with more competence than artistry, while Henry possessed a surprisingly fine singing voice, and the physical intimacy that continued to deepen their connection. They talked late into the night about everything and nothing, building the foundation of true partnership through countless small moments of sharing and understanding. "I received a letter from my mother today," Eleanor mentioned one evening as they prepared for bed. "She reports that London society is still quite scandalized by our marriage. Apparently Lady Thornbury has been saying that you will regret your choice once the novelty wears off, and you realize I am quite unsuitable as a duchess." Henry's expression darkened with anger. "That woman's malice knows no bounds. I hope you do not allow such poisonous speculation to disturb you." "Not particularly," Eleanor assured him, "though I confess to some concern that I might prove an embarrassment to you. I have no natural talent for the social performances expected of a woman in my position." Henry set aside the book he had been reading and gave her his full attention. "Eleanor, you must understand something. I did not marry you to acquire a performer of social rituals. I married you to have a partner in life, someone with whom I could share my thoughts, my challenges, my joys and sorrows. Everything else is secondary to that central purpose." He crossed to where she sat at her dressing table and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "You are not unsuitable as a duchess. You are unsuitable as a conventional duchess, which is precisely what makes you perfect for me. We will create our own version of what it means to be Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne, one that honors our values and principles rather than mindlessly replicating traditions that no longer serve any meaningful purpose. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears of gratitude and love. How did I become so fortunate as to find you? I ask myself the same question every day, he replied, leaning forward to kiss her softly. Now, no more worrying about London gossip. We have more important matters to attend to. As summer progressed into autumn, Eleanor grew increasingly confident in her new role. She discovered that many of the skills required for effective household management were similar to those she had developed through years of reading and analysis: attention to detail, logical organization, consideration of multiple perspectives. She worked closely with Mrs. Reynolds to improve conditions for the servants, implemented new systems for charitable distribution to the poor families on the estate, and began serious planning for the school that had become her passion project. The school consumed much of her energy and attention. She corresponded with educators in London and Edinburgh, researched curricula and pedagogical methods, consulted with architects about building design. Henry supported her efforts with enthusiasm and resources, helping her navigate the practical and political challenges of establishing an institution that would inevitably attract controversy. "We will face opposition," he warned during one of their planning sessions. "Many will argue that educating girls beyond basic literacy is unnecessary or even dangerous. We must be prepared to defend our choices with evidence and reason. If you love stories of courage and passion, subscribe and never miss one." "Then we shall gather that evidence," Eleanor replied with determination. "We will document the capabilities and achievements of our students, demonstrating conclusively that women possess the same capacity for learning as men. We will make our school a model that others must acknowledge and eventually emulate." By the time autumn arrived, and they prepared to return to London for the winter season, the school had progressed from dream to concrete plan. They had secured a suitable building, hired a headmistress whose progressive views aligned with their own, and developed a curriculum that would offer girls instruction in mathematics, sciences, languages, literature, and philosophy, subjects typically reserved exclusively for boys' education. Their return to London was met with mixed reactions. Some members of society had softened their initial criticism of the marriage, particularly as reports filtered back from Ashbourne Park about the Duchess's capable management and the Duke's evident happiness. Others remained sceptical or actively hostile, viewing Eleanor as an unsuitable duchess whose influence on her husband was corrupting his judgment. The first major test of Eleanor's position came at Lady Pembroke's ball, one of the season's premier events. As she and Henry entered the ballroom, conversation paused momentarily, as all eyes turned to assess the unconventional duchess. Eleanor held her head high, her hand resting confidently on Henry's arm, meeting curious gazes with composed dignity. Lady Pembroke, as hostess, greeted them with genuine warmth. Your Grace, how delightful to see you both. We have heard such wonderful reports from Ashbourne Park. You must tell me about this school I understand you are establishing." The genuine interest in Lady Pembroke's voice gave Eleanor confidence. She spent the next several minutes describing their educational project, her enthusiasm evident in every word. Other ladies gathered to listen, some with skepticism, but others with unmistakable interest. "But surely," one matron interjected, "too much education might make girls unsuitable for their natural roles as wives and mothers." "On the contrary," Eleanor replied firmly, but without aggression, "education enhances a woman's capacity to fulfill those roles effectively. An educated mother is better equipped to oversee her children's development, to manage household affairs efficiently, to engage meaningfully with her husband on matters of importance. Education does not diminish femininity, it completes it." Henry, who had been conversing with a group of gentlemen nearby, turned at the sound of her voice. Their eyes met across the space, and the pride and love in his expression gave Eleanor the confidence to continue. "Moreover," she added, warming to her subject, "not all women marry or bear children. Should those women be condemned to lives of enforced idleness and dependence simply because we fail to provide them with the tools for self-sufficiency and meaningful contribution to society?" If you love stories of courage and passion, subscribe and never miss one. The conversation that followed was spirited and sometimes contentious, but Eleanor held her ground with the same intellectual courage that had first attracted Henry's attention. Some ladies remained unconvinced, but others expressed tentative interest in learning more about the school. Several even suggested they might wish to contribute financially to the project or send daughters or nieces for education. Later that evening, as they danced together, Henry murmured his approval. "You were magnificent. You defended your principles with both passion and reason, and you won converts to our cause. I could not be prouder." "Some still think me terribly unsuitable," Eleanor observed with wry humor. "Let them," Henry replied dismissively. "The opinions of narrow-minded people matter far less than the work we are doing and the lives we will change through that work." As the season progressed, Eleanor and Henry settled into their roles as one of London's most talked-about couples. They attended social events selectively, choosing those that aligned with their interests or served useful purposes for their various projects. They hosted salons at Ashbourne House, where intellectuals, reformers, and progressive thinkers gathered for substantive conversation about literature, philosophy, politics, and social reform. These salons became famous throughout London, attracting attendees ranging from established scholars to young radicals hungry for engagement with new ideas. Eleanor proved to be a gifted hostess for such events, facilitating discussion with the same skill she had once applied to debate, ensuring that all voices were heard while maintaining productive focus on the topics at hand. "You have created something remarkable," Henry told her after one particularly successful evening. "You have made our home a centre of intellectual life in London. People are beginning to understand that being Duchess of Ashbourne means something more than hosting elegant dinners and wearing beautiful gowns." "We have created it together," Eleanor corrected. "This is our partnership, Henry. Everything we accomplish as equals." The school opened the following spring to a modest enrollment of 12 girls, ranging in age from 10 to 16. The opening day was both triumph and challenge. Triumph because they had succeeded in bringing their vision to reality. Challenge because the scrutiny on the institution was intense and often hostile. Eleanor visited the school weekly, observing classes, speaking with students, supporting the headmistress in her challenging work. She took particular interest in the older girls, whose hunger for knowledge mirrored her own youthful intellectual curiosity. She saw in their eager faces the women they might become, educated, capable, able to make meaningful contributions to society, regardless of whether they married or remained single. One afternoon, a girl of perhaps 15 approached her with shy determination. "Your Grace, may I ask you a question?" "Of course," Eleanor replied warmly, gesturing for the girl to sit beside her on the garden bench where she had been reading. "Is it true that you studied philosophy and political economy, that you read the same books as gentlemen study at university?" "It is true," Eleanor confirmed. "My father was unusually progressive and allowed me access to his library and my brother's tutors. I was very fortunate. And His Grace does not mind that you are so educated and have such strong opinions?" Eleanor smiled at the question that revealed so much about the girl's assumptions. "His Grace fell in love with me precisely because I am educated and have strong opinions. He values my mind as much as any other aspect of my character. He does not see my intelligence as a liability to be tolerated, but as an asset to be celebrated." The girl's eyes widened with wonder and hope. Then it is possible to be learned and still be loved, to have both knowledge and happiness. "It is not only possible, but necessary," Eleanor assured her. "Any love that requires you to diminish yourself, to hide your intelligence or suppress your opinions, is not worthy of the name. Wait for someone who loves you completely, mind, heart, and soul. Such people exist, though they may be rare." The conversation stayed with Eleanor long after she returned to Ashbourne House. That evening, she recounted it to Henry as they sat together in their private sitting room, she with her ever-present book, and he with a state correspondence that required his attention. "That girl reminded me of myself at her age," Eleanor reflected, "so hungry for knowledge, so afraid that wanting to learn meant accepting loneliness. I wish I could tell my younger self that it would all work out. that I would find you, that refusing to compromise would ultimately lead to the deepest happiness rather than perpetual isolation. Henry set aside his papers and moved to sit beside her, drawing her into his arms with tender possession. I wish I could tell my younger self to stop wasting time on women who bored me senseless and to find you sooner. Think of all the years we might have had together if we had encountered each other earlier. Perhaps we needed those years to become who we are, Eleanor suggested thoughtfully. Perhaps I needed to develop my convictions through years of defending them, and you needed to understand what you truly wanted through years of rejecting what you did not want. Perhaps we found each other at exactly the right moment. A romantic notion, Henry teased gently. I did not realize you harbored such sentiments beneath that rational, philosophical exterior. If you love stories of courage and passion, subscribe and never miss one. I contain multitudes, Eleanor replied with mock dignity. I can be both rational and romantic, philosophical and passionate. One need not choose between mind and heart when one has found the right partner. Their first year of marriage passed in a blur of activity, achievement, and deepening love. The school continued to grow, adding new students and expanding its curriculum. Eleanor's salons became increasingly influential, drawing progressive thinkers from across Britain and even continental Europe. Henry's estates flourished under management that balanced traditional agricultural methods with innovative approaches, informed by scientific research and genuine concern for tenant welfare. And through it all, their partnership strengthened. They learned each other's rhythms and moods, discovered how to support and challenge each other in equal measure, built a life that honored both duty and desire. They disagreed sometimes. Passionate people with strong convictions inevitably clash, but they learned to argue productively, to listen genuinely, to compromise when appropriate, and stand firm when principles were at stake. One evening in late autumn, as they prepared for bed after a particularly long day, Henry noticed Eleanor's hand resting on her abdomen with unconscious protectiveness. "Are you unwell?" he asked with immediate concern. Eleanor looked up, startled from her reverie, and then smiled with radiant joy. "Not unwell. Quite the opposite, actually. I was going to wait until I was certain, but, Henry, I believe I am with child." The expression that crossed Henry's face was one of pure, unguarded joy. He crossed to her in 3 quick strides, taking her face gently between his hands. "Truly, we are to have a child. If the physician confirms what I suspect, then yes, in late spring, we will welcome our son or daughter into the world." Henry pulled her into his arms with exquisite gentleness, as though she had suddenly become infinitely precious and fragile. "Eleanor, my love, I cannot find words adequate to express what I feel in this moment." "Then do not try," she murmured against his chest, hearing the rapid beating of his heart. "Simply feel it with me. We are creating a new life together, a child who will grow up in a household where intelligence is valued regardless of sex, where questions are encouraged rather than suppressed, where love and reason exist in harmony." Over the following months, as Eleanor's pregnancy progressed, she discovered that motherhood did not require the abandonment of all other pursuits, despite society's insistence to the contrary. She continued her work with the school, though with Henry's gentle insistence she reduced her schedule somewhat. She still hosted her salons, finding that pregnancy actually enhanced rather than diminished the respect accorded to her opinions. There was something about impending motherhood that made even conservative gentlemen more willing to listen to her views on education and social reform. "You are glowing," Charlotte observed during a visit, watching her sister move about the drawing room with graceful confidence despite her increasing size. "Motherhood agrees with you, though I confess I expected you to chafe more at the restrictions." "There are fewer restrictions than you might imagine," Eleanor replied with a smile. "Henry treats me as a partner who happens to be carrying our child, not as an invalid who requires constant supervision. It makes all the difference." The child, a daughter they named Catherine, arrived on a warm May morning after a labor that was mercifully brief for a first birth. When the midwife placed the squalling infant in Eleanor's arms, she felt a surge of love so powerful it momentarily overwhelmed her capacity for rational thought. Here was a tiny human being, perfect and vulnerable, who would grow up in a world that Eleanor and Henry were actively working to improve. Henry, who had paced anxiously outside the birthing chamber despite his attempts to maintain ducal composure, was admitted immediately after the birth. The expression on his face when he first saw his daughter, a mixture of awe, tenderness, and protective love, brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. "She is perfect," he whispered, touching one tiny hand with reverent gentleness. "She has your mouth, I think. And look at those fingers, so delicate, so perfect." "She will be brilliant," Eleanor predicted with maternal certainty. "We shall teach her to read and write, to question and analyze, to stand firm in her convictions. She will grow up knowing that her mind is as valuable as any man's. If you love stories of courage and passion, subscribe and never miss one." "She will grow up knowing she is loved unconditionally," Henry added, carefully taking his daughter into his arms. "And that her parents will support whatever path she chooses for her life, whether that be marriage or spinsterhood, scholarship or society, tradition or innovation." The christening of Lady Catherine Blackwood was attended by all of London society, curious to see the offspring of the unconventional Duchess and her devoted Duke. The baby, blessedly cooperative for the occasion, remained peaceful throughout the ceremony, her grey eyes so like her mother's, regarding the assembled company with what appeared to be solemn assessment. Lady Margaret, now a doting grandmother, could hardly contain her satisfaction. Her middle daughter, once considered unmarriageable, had not only secured the most eligible bachelor in England, but had also produced an heir to one of the realm's most ancient titles. That the heir was female rather than male was a minor disappointment, quickly overshadowed by the certainty that more children would follow. As Catherine grew from infant to toddler, the Ashbourne household became known for its unusual approach to child-rearing. Rather than confining their daughter to the nursery, under the exclusive care of servants, Eleanor and Henry involved themselves directly in Catherine's daily life. They read to her constantly, surrounded her with books and educational materials, encouraged her natural curiosity rather than suppressing it. "People are talking," Lady Margaret warned during one visit, finding her granddaughter seated on the library floor, surrounded by picture books while her parents worked nearby. "They say you are raising Catherine more like a boy than a girl." "We are raising her as an intelligent human being," Eleanor replied calmly. "When she is older, she may choose to embrace traditional feminine pursuits if they bring her joy, but she will make that choice from a position of education and autonomy, not from ignorance and lack of alternatives." The school, meanwhile, continued to flourish beyond their most optimistic projections. The first class of students graduated to widespread recognition of their achievements. Several secured positions as governesses in progressive households. One published a volume of poetry that received serious critical attention, and another gained admission to a women's educational institution in Scotland that had recently opened. The success of their graduates began to shift opinion, slowly but perceptibly, about the value of educating women. Other schools modelled on the Ashbourne Academy began to appear across England, though many lacked the resources and commitment that made the original so effective. Eleanor and Henry found themselves increasingly called upon to advise other educational reformers, to speak at gatherings of progressive thinkers, to use their position and influence to advance the cause of women's education. "We are changing minds," Henry observed one evening as they reviewed correspondence from various educational institutions seeking their guidance. "It is happening more slowly than either of us would prefer, but it is happening." "Every girl who receives a proper education is a victory," Eleanor agreed. "Every woman who discovers that her mind is valuable, that her thoughts matter, that she need not diminish herself to be worthy of love and respect. That is progress, measured one life at a time." 2 years after Catherine's birth, Eleanor delivered a son, whom they named Edmund after her beloved brother. The arrival of a male heir was greeted with even greater celebration than Catherine's birth had been, though Eleanor found the disparity irritating. If you love stories of courage and passion, subscribe and never miss one. "He is no more valuable than his sister," she told Henry firmly, as various relatives and acquaintances offered congratulations tinged with relief that the succession was now secure. "Of course not," Henry agreed immediately. though I confess to some relief that the pressure for a male heir has been satisfied. Now we may raise our children without that particular burden of expectation." Edmund proved to be a robust, cheerful child who adored his elder sister and followed her everywhere with determined devotion. Catherine, for her part, took her role as elder sibling seriously, teaching Edmund his letters as soon as he could focus his attention, reading to him constantly, protecting him with fierce loyalty from any perceived threat. Watching his children play together in the nursery, Henry reflected on how profoundly his life had changed since that evening at Lady Thornbury's ball when he had encountered an intelligent woman reading philosophy by the windows. "I was so certain I would remain unmarried," he told Eleanor later that evening. "I had resigned myself to a life of duty without joy, of managing estates and fulfilling obligations without any genuine connection or passion. And then you spoke to me with such refreshing honesty, challenged my assumptions, made me see the world differently. You saved me, Eleanor." "We saved each other," Eleanor corrected gently. "I was equally certain of spinsterhood, convinced that no man would value a woman who refused to pretend ignorance or suppress her opinions. We found each other at exactly the right moment when we had both stopped compromising and started insisting on what we truly needed." As their children grew, so did their influence on progressive causes throughout England. The Ashbourne salons became legendary, attracting the finest minds of their generation to discuss everything from political reform to scientific advancement to the moral implications of Britain's expanding empire. Eleanor's voice, once confined to private conversations and frustrated journal entries, now reached audiences across the nation through articles published under her own name, a shocking breach of convention that Henry supported absolutely. "The Duchess of Ashbourne has published another essay," society matrons would whisper, scandalized and secretly fascinated. "This one concerns the legal disabilities of married women. She argues that wives should be permitted to own property in their own names. Can you imagine?" Some could not imagine and condemned Eleanor as a dangerous radical whose influence threatened the very foundations of civilized society. But others, particularly younger women and progressive thinkers, found her arguments compelling and her example inspiring. She demonstrated that a woman could be simultaneously a devoted wife, a loving mother, an effective duchess, and an influential intellectual. The roles were not mutually exclusive, despite centuries of insistence to the contrary. The years passed with the peculiar acceleration that characterizes happy lives. Catherine and Edmund were joined by two more siblings, twin daughters named Margaret and Eleanor, whose arrival was greeted with equal joy regardless of their sex. The Ashbourne household became known for its unusual vitality, its combination of intellectual rigor and genuine warmth, its rejection of rigid formality in favor of authentic connection. The school grew from a single building educating 12 students to a substantial institution with multiple locations and hundreds of pupils. Other reformers, inspired by the Ashbourne example, established similar schools across England and even in Scotland and Ireland. The radical notion that women deserved education equal to that available to men began, slowly but inexorably, to gain acceptance among progressives and even some conservatives who recognized the practical benefits of educated mothers and wives. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Henry arranged a private celebration at Ashbourne Park, away from the demands of London society and the constant attention their unconventional life attracted. They walked together through the gardens in the golden light of a summer evening, reflecting on the decade they had shared. "Do you remember," Eleanor asked, "that first conversation at Lady Thornbury's ball? When you asked whether I observed rather than participated by choice or circumstance?" "I remember every word," Henry confirmed. "I remember thinking that I had never met anyone who spoke with such honesty and intelligence. I remember feeling for the first time in years genuinely interested in another person. I was so certain you would dismiss me once you realized I was not going to pretend ignorance or defer to male authority," Eleanor admitted. "I had been rejected so many times for being exactly who I am, and then you not only accepted me but celebrated the very qualities others found objectionable." Henry stopped walking and turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Eleanor, you are the finest person I have ever known. Your intelligence, your courage, your unwavering commitment to justice and truth, These qualities make you extraordinary. Our marriage has been the greatest blessing of my life, not despite your refusal to conform, but because of it. You have made me better, challenged me to think more deeply, inspired me to use my position and resources for meaningful change rather than merely maintaining tradition. And you have given me the freedom to be fully myself, Eleanor replied, her eyes bright with tears. You have created space for me to grow and learn and contribute, to be both wife and scholar, mother and reformer. You have never asked me to choose between different aspects of my identity, never demanded that I diminish one part of myself to emphasize another. They stood together in the fading light, surrounded by the beauty of the estate they had transformed together, thinking of the children sleeping peacefully in the house behind them, of the hundreds of girls whose lives had been changed by their educational work, of the countless conversations and debates that had shaped a decade of partnership. If you love stories of courage and passion, subscribe and never miss one. What shall we accomplish in the next 10 years? Henry asked with the enthusiasm that had never diminished despite the passage of time. Everything, Eleanor replied with characteristic ambition. We shall continue expanding educational opportunities for girls. We shall write and publish, using our voices to advocate for reform. We shall raise our children to be thoughtful, compassionate, courageous individuals who question unjust traditions and work to build a more equitable society. We shall prove through our own example and the examples of those we influence that women and men can be true partners in marriage, in intellectual pursuits, in the great work of making the world better than we found it. An ambitious program, Henry observed with a smile. We are ambitious people, Eleanor countered. We always have been. That is why we found each other, two souls unwilling to accept the limitations society tried to impose, searching for something more meaningful than conventional success or social approval. As darkness fell and they returned to the house, they could hear the sounds of their children being prepared for bed. Catherine reading a story to her younger siblings in the nursery, Edmund asking questions about the scientific principles behind starlight, the twins giggling over some private joke. It was the sound of a family built on love, respect, and the radical notion that every person, regardless of sex, deserved the opportunity to develop their full potential. Years later, when Catherine published her first book, a treatise on educational reform that built upon her parents' work, she dedicated it to "My mother and father, who taught me that courage and intelligence know no gender, that love and partnership are not incompatible with independence and achievement, and that the most revolutionary act is simply insisting on being fully human." The dedication was widely remarked upon, praised by progressives and criticized by conservatives who saw in it evidence of the dangerous ideas the Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne had been promoting for decades. But neither praise nor criticism mattered to Eleanor and Henry, who by then were grandparents watching their children raise another generation according to the same principles of equality, education, and unwavering commitment to human dignity. On a warm summer afternoon in their later years, Eleanor and Henry sat together in the library at Ashbourne Park, the room where so much of their partnership had unfolded, where they had read together and debated ideas and planned their various projects. They were older now, silver threading through their hair, lines of experience marking their faces, but the connection between them remained as strong as it had been that first evening at Lady Thornbury's ball decades earlier. "Do you have any regrets?" Eleanor asked, setting aside the book she had been reading. Henry considered the question seriously, as he always did when she asked something meaningful. "Not one," he finally replied. "Our path has not always been easy. We have faced criticism, hostility, social ostracism at times, but I would not change a single choice we made together. You are the love of my life, Eleanor, and our partnership has brought meaning and joy beyond anything I imagined possible." "I feel the same," Eleanor said softly. "I spent so many years believing that I would have to choose between authenticity and love, between being myself and being accepted. And then you appeared and demonstrated that the choice was false, that the right person would love me not despite who I am, but because of it." They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands as they had done countless times before, watching the afternoon light slant through the windows and illuminate the thousands of books that lined the walls. These books had been their companions and teachers, their inspiration and challenge. But the greatest lesson they had learned came not from any text, but from each other. That partnership between equals is possible, that love grows deeper when both parties are free to be fully themselves, that changing the world begins with refusing to accept unjust limitations on human potential. The Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne became legends in their own lifetime, not for their wealth or their titles or their social position, but for their unwavering commitment to education, equality, and the radical proposition that women and men could and should be partners in every sense of the word. Their schools educated thousands of girls who went on to become teachers, writers, reformers, and yes, wives and mothers, but wives and mothers who brought intelligence and education to those roles, who raised their own children with the same values of equality and dignity that had transformed the Ashbourne household. When historians later wrote about the gradual evolution of women's rights in England, they invariably mentioned the Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne, whose unusual marriage and tireless advocacy had helped shift public opinion and create new possibilities for future generations. But the true measure of their impact could not be captured in history books or statistical measures of educational attainment. If you love stories of courage and passion, subscribe and never miss one. It lived in every woman who read a book without shame, in every girl who asked questions without fear of rebuke, in every marriage that honored both partners as equals, in every family that valued character over convention. It lived in the quiet revolution that occurred when people began to question whether tradition justified continued injustice, when they started to imagine that the world might be organized differently, more fairly, with greater regard for human potential, regardless of the accident of sex. The Duke of Ashbourne and Miss Eleanor Hartley had found each other against all odds, two intelligent, principled, passionate individuals who refused to compromise their essential selves for social acceptance. In finding each other, they had discovered not just personal happiness, but a shared purpose that gave their lives meaning beyond their individual satisfaction. They had built a partnership based on mutual respect, intellectual companionship, and unwavering support for each other's growth and development. They had raised children who carried their values into the next generation. They had created institutions that educated thousands and influenced millions. They had demonstrated, through their own example, that love and equality are not contradictory but complementary, that the strongest marriages are those where both partners are free to be fully human. And in the end, when their lives drew to their natural conclusions, and they were laid to rest side by side in the family chapel at Ashbourne Park, their legacy was not measured in titles or wealth or social position. It was measured in changed minds and expanded possibilities, in girls who learned to read and women who learned to speak, in a slow but inexorable transformation of what society believed possible for half its population. The inscription on their shared memorial, composed by their daughter Catherine, read simply, "Here lie Henry Blackwood, Duke of Ashbourne, and Eleanor Hartley Blackwood, Duchess of Ashbourne, devoted partners in marriage and in the great work of expanding human dignity and possibility. They lived as equals, loved as partners, and left the world better than they found it." It was a fitting epitaph for two remarkable individuals who had found in each other not just romantic love but true partnership, and who had used that partnership to challenge an unjust world and create new possibilities for those who would come after. Their story became legend, passed down through generations as an example of what was possible when two people refused to accept artificial limitations, when they insisted on being fully themselves, when they built their lives according to their own values rather than society's expectations. It inspired countless others to seek similar partnerships, to refuse to compromise their essential selves, to believe that authentic love and authentic selfhood need not be mutually exclusive. And perhaps that was the greatest legacy of all. Not the schools they founded, or the essays they published, or the reforms they championed, but the simple demonstration that it was possible to be both fully oneself and fully loved, that intelligence and passion could coexist with tenderness and devotion, that the strongest partnerships were those built on equality, respect, and unwavering commitment to each other's flourishing. The Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne had found something rare and precious, a love that liberated rather than confined, that enhanced rather than diminished, that grew deeper with every passing year because it was built on the solid foundation of mutual respect and genuine partnership. They had proven that the most revolutionary act is sometimes simply insisting on being fully human, fully alive, fully oneself, and finding someone brave enough to love you exactly as you are. Their story ended not with sadness, but with fulfillment, knowing that they had lived according to their principles, loved without reservation, and left behind a legacy that would continue to inspire and challenge long after they were gone. They had changed the world, one conversation, one student, one mind at a time, and they had done it together, as true partners, proving that love and equality are not contradictory, but essential companions on the journey toward a more just and compassionate world. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this emotional journey. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe, like, comment, and share our channel. Your support inspires us to keep creating more stories of love, redemption, and breathtaking twists. Help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers, and together we'll continue sharing tales that warm the heart. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another of our historical stories. Click and let yourself be enchanted by another unforgettable tale. With all our gratitude, echoes of romance.